Today, we're delving into a compelling new work, Shella Omar Hashim's book, The Fault Lines of God, Ibn Khaldun's Cycle and Struggle for a New World Order. The prologue immediately plunges us into a vivid, almost unsettling picture of March 2026, where the world is grappling with an unprecedented convergence of crises. Alex 1, can you lay out for us what Hashim describes as these foundational crises?
Certainly. Hashim paints a stark picture. There's a geopolitical earthquake with the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, leading to chaos and threats of retaliation. The UN Security Council is paralyzed, with Russia, China, and Pakistan standing with Iran, while Western powers remain silent, showing deep global divisions. Economically, gold has shattered records above $5,500 an ounce, silver past $100, and central banks are hoarding bullion at levels not seen since the collapse of Bretton Woods, quietly challenging the dollar's dominance. Then there's a moral reckoning. The Epstein files have exposed global elites, from British royalty to American presidents, in a web of exploitation and blackmail, which the World Union of Muslim Scholars declared the, quote, collapse of the global ethical system, end quote. And finally, a civilizational realignment, with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia converting billions in loans into a Chinese-Pakistani JF-17 fighter jet deal, signaling a strategic pivot eastward as U.S. commitments in the Middle East appear unreliable.
That's an intense snapshot. It really sets the stage for the book's central question. Are we merely witnessing random chaos, or are these events moving according to deeper, perhaps historical rhythms? And to help us understand these rhythms, Hashim introduces 4 key guides. Who are these intellectual figures, and what perspective do they each bring to this complex landscape?
The first is Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century North African sage. He diagnosed the rise and fall of dynasties through asabiya, which is social cohesion, teaching that power is cyclical and that desert warriors often conquered decadent cities, only to become decadent themselves within 4 generations. Then there's Samuel P. Huntington, the Harvard political scientist who predicted that culture, not ideology, would be the post-Cold War battleground with his Clash of Civilizations thesis. Ali A. Alawi, an Iraqi statesman and scholar, diagnoses the internal crisis of Islamic civilization itself, arguing it's lost its spiritual center while chasing the West's material ghost, trapped between autocracy, secularism, and violent extremism. And finally, Henry Kissinger, the diplomat historian who saw world order as a temporary truce between competing civilizations' views of legitimacy, warning that the West's universalism clashes with others' particularism.
It's fascinating how these figures, spanning centuries and disciplines, are brought together to analyze our current moment. Let's start with Khaldun. His concept of asabiya, or social cohesion, feels particularly relevant. Chapter 1 uses a Khaldunian lens to examine modern political movements. How does asabiya manifest in the 21st century? And what's the core difference between the asabiya Khaldun described and what we see today?
Khaldun's core idea is that group solidarity born from adversity propels societies to conquer and govern. This cohesion is strongest in what he calls the periphery, think desert tribes or revolutionary movements, which can overcome a decadent center. The 21st century offers new examples. The MAGA movement in the United States, with its intense loyalty and shared grievance against perceived decadent elites, exhibits modern asabiya. Similarly, the 1979 Iranian Revolution was born from peripheral cohesion that overthrew a monarch, though the Islamic Republic now struggles with internal fragmentation. The distinction now is the type of asabiya. Khaldun described organic, often tribal bonds. Today, we see engineered asabiya, like China's Communist Party maintaining cohesion through anti-Western rhetoric and nationalism, or Western democracies using narratives to combat polarization. The question Hashim poses is whether this engineered solidarity can ever match the durability of organically grown bonds rooted in shared hardship and moral commitment.
That distinction between organic and engineered cohesion is critical. It implies a potential fragility in modern systems. Chapter 2, The Economics of Decadence, delves deeper into this, linking luxury and concentrated wealth to the erosion of asabiya. Khaldun famously said that luxury softens conquerors. How does Hashim connect Khaldun's ancient warning about decadence to today's financial systems and the flight to real assets like gold and silver?
Hashim shows that when the ruling class lives in excess while the productive base suffers, the social fabric frays. Urban centers become decadent, dependent on mercenary forces rather than engaged citizens. In our time, she points to Western governments with unsustainable debt levels and the dominance of financialization, making money from money rather than production. The Epstein files, for instance, are highlighted as a stark modern example of moral decay and wealth concentration eroding trust, reinforcing Khaldun's observation that luxury softens conquerors. In this environment, trust shifts from fiat currency, which Omar saw as a tool of geopolitical leverage losing confidence, to tangible assets. Gold and silver, historically valued and universally recognized, become a refuge. For Muslims particularly, silver carries added significance as the currency of the Prophet's time, reinforcing ethical legitimacy in economic activity.
So the economic shifts are deeply tied to a crisis of moral authority, accelerating the search for intrinsic value. This brings us to modern forms of cohesion. Chapter 3 discusses digital tribes and virtual asabiya. How do today's digital networks compare to traditional forms of cohesion, and what are their strengths and weaknesses?
Digital networks allow peripheries to cohere virtually, forming communities bound by shared beliefs rather than territory. Movements like MAGA show how dispersed populations can act in concert through digital forums, amplifying narratives and mobilizing followers. This demonstrates Khaldun's insight that a cohesive periphery can challenge the center. However, digital cohesion is often brittle. Unlike traditional bonds of family or shared hardship, virtual networks are vulnerable to misinformation, factionalism, and external control. The Arab Spring movements, for example, showed rapid organization through social media, but without institutional structures or ethical grounding, they fragmented. Hashim emphasizes that speed and intensity in the digital realm do not replace deep social roots. They can actually amplify volatility, as seen when digital cohesion proves intense but temporary.
That's a crucial point. Intensity doesn't equal durability. Now, shifting focus to the Islamic world specifically, Chapter 6 addresses Wahhabism, the spirit, and civilizational recovery. Ali argues that literalist movements have displaced centuries of intellectual and spiritual richness. What does this cohesion without spirit look like, and how does it leave societies vulnerable?
Alawi's critique points to movements like Salafism and Wahhabism, which prioritize textual purity over interpretive depth. This leads to an emphasis on outward compliance, prayer, dress, ritual, while the ethical, philosophical, and reflective dimensions recede, displacing rich Sufi and jurisprudential traditions. In places like the Gulf states, this has resulted in societies rich in material power, able to build skyscrapers, but searching for spiritual and moral grounding. This cohesion without spirit creates stability, but leaves civilizations ethically brittle and vulnerable to both internal decay and external pressures. Even Iran, despite its philosophical Shia traditions, illustrates how revolutionary asabiya can become authoritarian and disconnected from moral aspirations, as seen in recent protests. Khaldun's lesson is clear. The periphery may rise, but without ethical grounding, both centers and peripheries remain vulnerable to collapse.
So even with significant wealth or revolutionary zeal, a lack of ethical and spiritual depth ultimately undermines long-term cohesion. Chapter 7 introduces Henry Kissinger's idea that world order is merely a temporary truce, within what Hashim calls the multipolar trap. What defines this trap, and how does it manifest with the end of American hegemony and the rise of other civilizational powers?
The multipolar trap is a structural state where multiple great powers coexist, each with distinct conceptions of legitimacy and moral authority, lacking a shared framework. With the end of American hegemony, evidenced by internal divisions, strategic overreach, and economic dislocation, the U.S. is still powerful but increasingly fragile. China's rise isn't just economic, it's civilizational, based on hierarchy, state-led development, and strategic patience, challenging Western universalism. Russia reasserts itself through orthodox identity and strategic alliances, reshaping the balance of power. The Islamic world, despite its potential, remains fragmented. The trap's danger lies in divergent norms and the potential for rapid escalation when centers fail to recognize others' legitimate frameworks. Kissinger understood that order is negotiated, not enforced, requiring diplomacy and respect for difference.
This leads back to the economic signals we discussed earlier. Chapter 8, The Flight to Real Value, explores gold and silver not just as financial assets, but as civilizational signals. How do these metals represent a rejection of fiat currency and reflect the moral vacuum in the West?
Hashim argues that the global rush to gold and silver is a civilizational signal as much as a financial one. It reflects declining trust in fiat currency, exacerbated by its geopolitical weaponization and the moral collapse exposed by the Epstein files. Gold acts as a mirror of global sentiment, signaling distrust in dominant powers and skepticism toward financial elites. Silver's ascent highlights both its industrial necessity for green tech and AI and its historical and ethical significance in Islamic tradition as a currency tied to real value. This flight from fiat is a rejection of a system divorced from ethical governance, a search for tangible intrinsic value that stands against the decadence of centers losing legitimacy.
So the economic shifts are a direct reflection of deeper civilizational dynamics and a crisis of trust. Given all these challenges, Chapter 9, How Muslims Should Respond, offers practical pathways. What's the recommended third path for Muslims, avoiding both Western imitation and reactionary isolation?
The book stresses rejecting both extremes. Muslims should avoid emulating the West's model, which shows moral decay and fragility. Similarly, reactionary isolation, like authoritarian political Islam or rigid literalism, suppresses innovation and creates brittle societies. The recommended third path is to be engaged, ethically coherent, and materially prudent. This involves critically returning to Islamic sources, reinforcing ethical consistency, and building asabiya, grounded in truth and justice. It also means engaging the world on principle, participating in global forums and alliances without compromising values, and preparing materially by diversifying assets into tangibles like gold and silver. Crucially, it involves investing in knowledge, innovation, upholding ethics and governance, like transparent and accountable institutions, and mobilizing youth as agents of renewal, guided by knowledge, ethics, and purpose.
This framework really brings together the insights of all four thinkers, offering a blueprint for renewal. The conclusion of the book synthesizes their lessons into a hopeful vision. What's the ultimate takeaway for civilizations facing these turbulent cycles, particularly for the Islamic world?
The ultimate takeaway is that Khaldun's cycles are descriptive, not deterministic. Awareness allows for conscious intervention. Hashim synthesizes that cohesion must be organic and ethically grounded, not manufactured. Huntington reminds us that identity and culture are central to global politics, requiring engagement from a position of cultural confidence. Alois stresses that internal spiritual and ethical renewal is paramount, as external material success alone isn't enough. And Kissinger teaches that world order is negotiated, demanding strategic engagement with principle and flexibility. For the Islamic world, this means strengthening institutions, building ethical communities, aligning wealth with morality, and mobilizing youth. The message is that civilizations rise and fall, but renewal is possible when power, ethics, and wisdom converge, allowing them to navigate the multipolar trap and shape a more just, resilient future.
This exploration of Shella Omar Hashim's The Fault Lines of God offers a profound framework for understanding our complex world. Share this episode with anyone interested in the deeper currents shaping global events.